Did you know the extent of Disney's rivalry with Universal Studios and how it all began? You see, the history of Universal Studios is kind of interesting, and the way it developed with Disney is interesting as well. By the time Disney had announced Disney's Mgm Studios, Universal had already been trying for over 4 years to try and build their own studio tour theme park in Orlando, Florida. They had already bought 400 acres of land in Central Florida. All they needed was a partner to help financially back the park, which was estimated to cost over $200 million. Then Disney announced their own studio tour / park called Mgm Studios, and things began to get ugly. Universal head Sid Sheinberg wasn't too happy about this. He thought that Disney was stepping on Universal's turf by trying to put together a movie studio tour, whereas Disney felt the exact opposite. They felt that Universal was stepping on their turf by trying to put a theme park in Central Florida. But you see, it goes much more beyond that. Sid didn't only think that Disney and Eisner was taking the general idea from Universal and stealing it for Disney. He thought that Disney was stealing specific ideas about Universal Studios for their own park. And this goes back to before Michael Eisner was even a part of the Disney company. Like I said earlier, Universal was trying for 4 years to get funding for this theme park. And so they were shopping around the idea of many other movie studios to try and partner up with them. And one of those studios was Paramount. As part of the pitch, they had to show a lot of details and plans for the park along with plans for attractions. Now here's the thing, before coming to Disney, Michael Eisner was one of the top executives at Paramount, and Sid insists that Eisner must have seen some of these plans in some form or another, and that's where he got a lot of his plans later on for Disney's Mgm Studios. Eisner of course denies all of this, but we'll never really know the truth. That said, there is some similarities between their plans that actually lend to the suggestion that Eisner might have taken directly from Universal. For instance, there's the backlot tour. Now, the idea of a backlot tour as a whole wasn't that unique, and it was sort of to be expected for a park of this theme. However, the backlot tour in Disney had this scene called Catastrophe Canyon, in which you ride and you stop in this canyon and there's a gas tanker explosion and water floods everywhere. There's a lot of cool stunts, and it was sort of a way to show the practical stunts in the film industry. Universal itself had plans for a tram attraction, and itself had a stunt scene called the Hollywood Canyon Disaster. In this scene, the tram would stop on a bridge overlooking the beautiful Hollywood Hills, and suddenly an earthquake would hit California and power lines would fall and there'd be sparks and explosions. And suddenly the earthquake would break a dam up in the Hollywood Hills and water would come surging down and around the tram. And the tram would pull off just before the bridge collapses. Except it would pull off into an oil field where a rig would lose control and slam into an oil tank, causing this giant fiery explosion. Sound familiar? It should, because it sounds very similar to Catastrophe Canyon in Disney. Ultimately, though, because Disney announced their plans for Mgm Studios before Universal announced their plans for Universal Studios, Universal had to change their ideas, even if they did supposedly come first. Sid understood that suing Disney wasn't probably going to turn out well for them. It would have been expensive, it would have taken a long time, it would have been dragged out, and there was of course the constant possibility that they wouldn't even win the lawsuit. So Universal looked for more creative ways to retaliate. For instance, around that time, Disney was planning to work on a 40-acre entertainment and shopping complex in Burbank, California, and Universal actually ended up filing suit against the city to try and stop it, and led this anonymous anti-Disney campaign aimed towards the residents of the area to try and dissuade them from welcoming Disney with open arms. Ultimately, Disney decided that it was too expensive and they dropped those plans, although we have no idea how much of an effect Universal's campaign had on that decision. Ultimately, Universal did find a partner who was willing to help fund the park. The Canadian company Cineplex Odeon was willing to take 50% of the share of Universal Studios for around $92 million. But before they started building anything, Sid went to Disney, and Universal tried to pitch that they would pull the plug on Universal Studios in return for a 50% share in this new Disney theme park, and the idea would be that the two companies would run it together, and they'd sort of, rather than fight each other, have this one shared experience. Disney didn't really love the idea. They were willing to pay a small licensing fee to use some Universal titles, the Universal name, and some of their movies in the theme park, because Disney felt that they didn't have as large of a library of films geared towards older audiences, but they didn't want a partnership. And Sid realized that any deal that they would have would involve Disney still running the show and owning the park completely. Now, if that plan sounds familiar, it's because that's what Disney eventually ended up doing with MGM Studios, and that's why when the park opened, it was called Disney's MGM Studios, which of course now we know as Disney's Hollywood Studios. Why it's not called MGM anymore is the topic for a whole other video. So with that plan falling apart, Universal decided to move forward with building their own theme park in Central Florida. So here's where it gets interesting. You see, both parks were announced relatively at the same time, Disney a little bit sooner, so you would think they'd be built around the same time. But Disney had the upper hand for a couple of reasons. One, Eisner was looking to build a half-day theme park. He didn't want something as large as the Magic Kingdom, and with their latest park, Epcot, going so far over budget, it was important to him to keep the experience small and short with the opportunity to expand later. So the park was a little bit smaller. On top of that, Disney was part of Reedy Creek's Improvement District, which is sort of Disney's own self-governing land. Again, that's a great topic for a whole other video because there are so many benefits that Disney has for being part of Reedy Creek Improvement District. One of them is that there's a lot less red tape to cut through when it came to building. So as a result, even though the parks were announced relatively close to each other, Disney's park was going to be finished a lot sooner and ready for the public. So they started building the park, and the plans were to open it in May of 1989, and leading up to that, rivalry got pretty fierce. Some called it the Tour Wars. There was a lot of bragging going on back and forth. For instance, at first, Disney announced that they were going to build 3 sound stages in MGM Studios that would be fully functional and working for production, so naturally Universal announced that they were going to build 4 of them. Universal also bragged because they had the famous director Steven Spielberg signed on as a creative consultant, and so Disney in turn bragged about the fact that they had George Lucas signed on to help them out as well for attractions. The funny part being that Spielberg and Lucas were at the time and still are pretty close friends. So in May of 1989, MGM Studios opened, and Disney, smart and learning from their past with Disneyland, Disney World, and Epcot, they went ahead and pre-recorded a lot of their opening ceremony that would be televised to the public. This gave them the opportunity to cut out any sort of mistakes that happened along the way, any down points, and really just focus on the positive and make it look like the opening went off without a hitch. Universal Studios, on the other hand, wouldn't open until almost a year and a half later in 1990, and they faced an opening that was very similar to Disneyland's. There were a lot of ride breakdowns, and as a result, the lines for the rides that were working really backed up and got pretty long. Over 10% of the opening day attendance of Universal Studios ended up flooding guest relations, demanding refunds, angry to complain about broken rides and long lines. And so while MGM Studios opened to smiles and, flawless performances and guests, Universal Studios opened to angry crowds and broken rides. And then to add salt to that wound, Disney ended up planning a really star-studded and big grand premiere for Dick Tracy over in Pleasure Island just a couple of days after Universal opened in order to take attention away from Universal's opening. And all of this did affect Universal. In fact, attendance was so low in those opening weeks that they ended up cutting back on a lot of employee hours for people who worked in the park because there just weren't as many people as they were hoping for. Now, luckily, we as Disney fans could be thankful for Universal because there are a couple of things in the parks that exist because Universal is there to act as a rival. For instance, initially around the time of Universal's opening, the Hard Rock Cafe had approached Disney in hopes to partner and find a place to put one of their restaurants in Disney property. Disney and Eisner specifically, still having this mentality of we can do anything that we want to do but better, turned them down thinking that they'd be able to do their own entertainment restaurant. So the Hard Rock Cafe went to Universal and it opened there, and it was a big hit. So Disney, learning from that and not wanting to pass up on another good opportunity, when later approached by Planet Hollywood, grabbed it and they built a Planet Hollywood restaurant in downtown Disney, and that's why that's there. We could also thank Universal Studios for the Tower of Terror. That ride exists because not only were they trying to keep up with the thrill rides of Universal Studios, but they wanted to beat Universal at their own game by creating their own thrill rides. And of course, now we know what happened after that. Universal Studios had their Islands of Adventure expansion, it had Marvel attractions, it has Harry Potter attractions, and now there's the newly announced deal that they're going to be developing attractions along with Nintendo. And so it's clear to see that Universal Studios bounced back from its lackluster opening and has flourished into being a pretty strong rival against the Disney theme parks. But it's interesting to look back and see how this rivalry began and see how personal it got at times. So that's just a quick look at Universal's rivalry with Disney. I want to thank you for watching. If you have a Disney Did You Know that you'd like to leave, feel free to leave it in the comments below or let me know on Twitter. I'm at RobPlays. Whatever you're doing this week, make the most of it because it makes it that much better. And I hope to see you next time for the next Did You Know Disney. Bye, everyone.